Welcome to RadOnc Smart Review Physics Edition. Today we're diving into a couple of really core modern techniques: intensity modulated radiation therapy, IMRT, and its evolution, volumetric modulated arc therapy, or VMAT.
That's right. These have really changed the game compared to what came before, like 3D conformal or 3D CRT. Remember we talked about how that uses forward planning?
Yeah, where the planner basically designs the beams, the shapes, angles, weights, and then sees what dose distribution comes out.
Exactly. You're kind of stacking bricks, simple shapes, to build the dose.
And that works fine for simpler cases, but it really struggles when you have, say, a complex target shape, maybe something concave.
Or wrapped right around a critical structure, an OAR, an organ at risk.
Right. You try to cover that tricky target, and boom, you've blasted the OAR with too much dose.
Your sculpting ability is limited with just those basic tools. And that's precisely where IMRT and VMAT come in. They allow you to vary or modulate the intensity across each beam. But that needs a whole different way of thinking about planning.
Okay, so let's dig into that, this different planning philosophy. What's the core idea?
The big shift, the paradigm shift really, is from that forward planning to what we call inverse planning.
Inverse, okay.
So instead of defining the beams first and then seeing the dose, with inverse planning, you flip it. You start by telling the computer the dose distribution you want.
Ah, okay, so I don't start with use this beam shape. I start with I need this target volume to get, say, 50 gray.
Exactly. And this nearby spinal cord absolutely cannot get more than 45 gray. You define the desired outcome first.
So you're defining clinical goals up front.
Precisely. You set dose objectives for your target volumes. You know, the GGers, CTV, PTV we've talked about, like at least 95% of the PTV volume must receive 100% of the prescribed dose. Or maybe a max dose objective, no more than 107% in the PTV.
And crucially for the OARS, the structures you need to protect.
Absolutely critical. You define dose constraints. These are usually hard limits based on known tolerances. Maximum point dose to the brainstem must be below 54 gray, or the mean dose to the contralateral parotid gland needs to stay under 26 gray if you want to preserve saliva.
Okay, so you feed the treatment planning system, the TPS, this whole list of demands target doses, OAR limits. It sounds complicated. How does the computer actually figure out the beam intensities needed to meet that wish list?
Well, it is computationally intensive, definitely. It uses something called a cost function, or sometimes objective function. Think of it like a penalty score.
A penalty score?
Yeah, the function combines all your objectives and constraints mathematically. If the calculated dose in the PTV is too low, the cost goes up. If the dose in an OAR is too high, the cost goes up maybe even much faster as you exceed the limit.
So the computer's goal is simply to find the plan that results in the lowest possible score on this cost function.
Exactly. It's an optimization problem. The TPS uses powerful optimization algorithms. You might hear names like simulated annealing or conjugate gradient descent, things like that.
Okay.
These algorithms essentially treat the final dose distribution as being made up of contributions from thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of tiny individual beamlets from all the different angles you've chosen.
Beamlets, like tiny pixels of radiation.
Sort of, yeah. And the algorithm iteratively adjusts the intensity or weight of each of these beamlets. It tries turning this one up, that one down, calculates the resulting dose, checks the cost function score.
Sees if the score got better or worse.
Right. And it does this over and over, millions of times potentially, tweaking the intensities across the field from all angles, constantly trying to minimize that overall cost.
It's searching for the sweet spot.
It's searching through a massive possibility space for the optimal combination of intensities. And the result of this whole optimization process for each beam angle is what we call a fluence map.
A fluence map.
Yeah, it's basically a 2D picture showing the ideal radiation intensity needed at every point in that beam's eye view to best achieve your goals. It often looks quite complex, not just a simple shape.
You used a sculptor analogy before, right? How does that fit in here?
It helps illustrate the difference. With forward planning, you're the sculptor telling your assistant exactly where to hit the stone and how hard you define the beams directly.
Okay.
With inverse planning, you give the assistant a detailed picture, maybe even a 3D model, of the statue you want, and you point out specific, delicate areas saying, make it look like this, but whatever you do, do not chip this part here or damage that bit there.
Ah, so the optimization algorithm has to figure out the complex sequence of tiny chisel taps needed to match the blueprint while obeying all the do not touch rules.
Precisely. It's a different level of control, letting the computer handle the fine details of intensity distribution to meet the broader goals.
Okay, so the optimizer spits out these ideal fluence maps. beautiful intensity patterns. But you said our LINACs, our machines, can't just paint with radiation like that. They use those multi-leaf collimators, the MLCs.
Correct. The LINAC produces a beam that's, pretty uniform across the field when it's wide open.
Yeah.
The MLCs, those layers of shifting tungsten leaves, are what we use to shape the beam. And for IMRT and VMAT, crucially, they're used to modulate the intensity.
But they can't make a smooth gradient all at once.
No, they can block parts of the beam or open apertures, but they can't create that continuously varying intensity pattern directly like the fluence map shows.
So there's a gap.
Yeah.
How do we bridge that gap between the ideal map and what the machine can actually do?
That's where the next piece of software comes in, the leaf sequencing algorithm.
Leaf sequencing. Okay.
Its job is to take that optimized fluence map for a specific beam angle and basically break it down, decompose it into a sequence of concrete deliverable MLC shapes. And for each shape, it calculates how much beam on time, measured in monitor units or MUs, is needed.
So like you said before, it's like translating the painting into a series of stencil shapes and instructions for how long to spray paint through each one.
That's a great way to think about it. It's creating the step-by-step recipe for the MLCs. But it's not just dumbly chopping up the map. It has to be smart about the LINAC's physical limits.
Like what?
Well, things like how fast the MLC leaves can actually move. They're mechanical. They have speed limits. It also considers the physical width of each leaf, usually 5 or maybe 10 millimeters wide at the isocenter.
Right.
And it has to account for the fact that even when the leaves are closed, a tiny bit of radiation, maybe 1–2%, can still transmit through the tungsten.
And you mentioned the tongue and groove thing.
Yes, that too. The leaves often have this interlocking tongue and groove design on the sides to minimize leakage between adjacent leaves when they move. But this means there's a slight underdose right at the junction due to the overlap. The leaf sequencer accounts for all these physical realities.
So it's trying to approximate the ideal fluence map as closely as possible given all the machine's constraints.
Exactly. It's the crucial link between the mathematical ideal and the physically deliverable reality.
Okay, got it. So we have the plan, optimized, sequenced. Now, how does the machine actually deliver this modulated intensity? You mentioned different flavors of IMRT.
Right. There are two main ways IMRT is delivered using those MLCs. The first one is often called step and shoot.
Step and shoot. Static MLC IMRT.
That's the one. So the LINAC gantry moves to a specific planned angle and stops. Then, while the beam is off, the MLC leaves move to form the first complex aperture shape from the sequence.
Beam off. Leaves move.
Right. Once they're in position and still, the beam turns on for the calculated number of MUs for that shape. Then beam turns off again. The MLCs move to the next shape for that same gantry angle, beam off.
Beam on for the next dose pulse. Beam off.
Exactly. It repeats for multiple segments, as they're called, at each gantry angle. You might have, say, 5 to 20 segments per angle, and a typical plan might use maybe 5, 7, or 9 different static gantry angles around the patient.
So a sequence of static snapshots delivering bits of dose at each one. Makes sense. What's the other main type?
That's dynamic MLC IMRT, often called the sliding window technique.
Dynamic. Sliding window.
Oh, okay.
This is a bit more complex because here the MLC leaves are actually moving while the radiation beam is on.
Whoa, okay. Leaves moving with the beam on. How does that work precisely?
So the gantry is still held at a fixed angle for each beam, like step and shoot. But instead of static shapes, opposing pairs of MLC leaves sweep across the field, creating a moving window or gap between them.
A sliding window. Got it.
And by carefully controlling the speed of the leaves as they sweep and the width of that window, you modulate the dose. If the leaves sweep faster over a region, it gets less dose. If they slow down or the window widens over a region, it gets more dose.
So the intensity is painted on dynamically by how fast the window moves and how wide it is.
Precisely. It's a continuous modulation during the sweep. Requires very precise synchronization between the leaf motors and the beam control. Yeah, I bet. Now, you mentioned something important about planning for either step and shoot or sliding window. Avoiding simple beam arrangements.
Ah, yes. A key planning point, especially coming from 3D CRT, is that for IMRT, you generally want to avoid using just simple parallel opposed fields, like just an AP and a PA beam.
Why not? Seems simplest.
It's simple geometrically, but for inverse planning, it really ties the optimizer's hands. If you have a target that's, say, C-shaped around the spinal cord, trying to get high dose in the C and low dose in the cord using just beams directly opposite each other is extremely difficult. The optimizer might struggle, or it might end up using ridiculously high monitor units to try and force the solution.
So you get suboptimal plans or just inefficient delivery?
Often, yes. The recommendation is usually to use multiple non-opposing beams. Something like 7 or 9 beams spaced out around the patient gives the optimizer much more angular freedom to modulate the intensity effectively and sculpt the dose conformally around the target while avoiding OARs.
More angles give the optimizer more tools, more flexibility. Okay, now building on this, you said VMAT is the next evolution.
Yes, volumetric modulated arc therapy, VMAT. It basically takes the IMRT principle, inverse planning, modulated intensity, and applies it while the gantry is continuously rotating around the patient.
So no stopping. The beam is on while the whole machine is spinning.
That's the key. The gantry typically sweeps in 1 or more continuous arcs, often 360 degrees, sometimes partial arcs. And here's the kicker. As the gantry rotates, multiple things are changing simultaneously.
Multiple things, like what?
The MLC leaf positions are constantly moving to shape the beam dynamically. The dose rate, how fast the MUs are being delivered, is often being adjusted in real time.
Yeah.
And sometimes, even the speed of the gantry rotation itself can vary during the arc.
Wow, okay, hold on. MLC's moving, dose rate changing, gantry speed changing, all while it's rotating. That sounds incredibly complex to coordinate.
It is. It's a highly sophisticated choreography between the planning system and the machine. But the advantage is enormous. By modulating everything simultaneously during rotation, you're effectively delivering intensity-modulated beams from, hundreds or even thousands of angles along that arc.
So a huge number of beam angles packed into one smooth rotation.
Exactly. Which allows for potentially even higher conformality and critically very efficient delivery.
Okay, let's compare VMAT directly to, say, the step-and-shoot IMRT. What are the big differences in practice?
Well, the most noticeable difference is probably speed, delivery speed.
I guess continuous movement is faster than stop, start, stop, start.
Significantly faster. A complex VMAT plan, maybe using 1 or 2 full arcs, might be delivered in just, say, 2 to 5 minutes per fraction.
2 to 5 minutes, wow.
Yeah. Whereas a comparable step-and-shoot plan with 7 or 9 fields and lots of segments per field could easily take 10, 15, even 20 minutes to deliver.
That's a huge difference for the patient lying on the table.
Absolutely. Better comfort, less chance for them to move during treatment, which maintains accuracy, and just overall clinic efficiency is much higher.
Okay, speed is a big win for VMAT.
Yeah.
What about monitor units? Does all that complex motion mean more beam on time, more MUs?
You might think so, but actually, VMAT often uses fewer total monitor units than a step-and-shoot IMRT plan for comparable plan quality.
Really? Fewer MUs. Why is that beneficial?
Fewer MUs generally means less unwanted dose, specifically less potential dose from radiation leaking through the Linac head components, and at higher energies, less neutron dose. So it can contribute to a slightly lower overall dose burden to the patient outside the target area.
So VMAT is faster and potentially uses fewer MUs. That sounds like a double win.
It often is, which is why VM has become so popular. The main trade-off, though, is complexity.
Ah, right. Coordinating all those moving parts.
Exactly. Commissioning a machine to deliver VMAT accurately and then doing the quality assurance for each patient's VMAT plan involves verifying the synchronization of more variables, MLCs, dose rate, gantry speed, gantry angle, all working together perfectly. It can be more demanding than QA for step-and-shoot.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly sophisticated process. Inverse planning, creating ideal maps, leaf sequencing, making them deliverable, complex dynamic delivery with IMRT or VMAT. This sounds like something you absolutely must check before you use it on a patient.
You are absolutely right. That brings us to patient-specific quality assurance, or QA. And let me be crystal clear. This is not optional. It is absolutely mandatory for every single IMRT and VMAT plan before the patient's first treatment fraction.
Mandatory, not just recommended.
Mandatory, period. Because every plan is unique, tailored to that specific patient's anatomy and dose goals, and involves such complex delivery sequences, you simply have to verify that the Linac can actually deliver what the TPS calculated. You don't treat until that verification is done and passed.
So it's not enough to just do general machine checks. You have to test the actual plan for this specific patient.
Yes. The patient-specific QA process aims to confirm that the whole complex interplay of MLC movements, dose rate changes, gantry motion for VMAT, all of it, accurately produces the intended dose distribution for that unique plan.
Okay, walk me through the typical steps. How do you do this QA?
Sure. First, you take the patient's approved treatment plan from the TPS. But instead of calculating the dose on the patient's CT scan, you recalculate it onto a standardized, simple geometry, a dosimetric phantom.
A phantom, like a block of plastic.
Yeah, usually a flat slab or maybe a cylinder made of water-equivalent plastic. It's a known uniform material. The TPS calculates what the dose should look like inside the simple phantom if the plan were delivered perfectly.
So you have a predictable target to measure against.
Exactly. Then you take that same approved patient plan, same MUs, same MLC sequences, same gantry angles or arcs, and you actually deliver it on the treatment machine, but aimed at this phantom.
Okay, you run the plan on the phantom.
And while you're delivering it, you use some kind of radiation detector system placed inside or on the phantom to measure the dose distribution that the machine actually delivers.
So now you have two dose maps for the phantom.
Yeah.
The one that TPS predicted and the one you measured.
Correct. And the final crucial step is to compare them. You overlay the measured dose map onto the calculated dose map for that phantom geometry and check how well they agree. Are the hot spots in the right place? Are the cold spots where they should be? Are the dose gradients, the sharp fall-offs, matching?
What kind of detectors do you use to make that measurement in the phantom?
There are a few common tools. One is radiochromic film.
The film that darkens with radiation.
Yep. Its big advantage is excellent spatial resolution. It's like a continuous sensor. You can scan it very finely. Great for seeing intricate details in IMRT VMAT patterns.
What?
But it's fiddly. Needs careful handling, calibration, a good scanner, and it's not real time. You irradiate it, then process and scan it later.
What's more common now, maybe faster.
2D detector arrays are very widely used. These are flat panels, basically, embedded with a grid of hundreds or thousands of tiny detectors, usually ionization chambers or diodes.
Like a digital camera sensor for radiation.
Kind of, yeah. You place this array in the phantom, deliver the plan, and it gives you an electronic map of the dose readings at each detector location almost instantly. Very convenient, very fast. The limitation is spatial resolution. You only get a reading at each detector point, not in between.
Okay. Any other main options?
The third big one is EPID dosimetry. EPID stands for Electronic Portal Imaging Device.
That's the imager built into the LINAC head, right?
Yeah.
Used for patient positioning.
Exactly. But with careful calibration and specialized software that models how the EPD responds to radiation, you can actually use it to measure the fluence or dose pattern delivered by the beam, either after passing through the phantom or sometimes even just in air.
Using the built-in imager for QA.
Yeah.
That sounds efficient.
It can be very efficient, yes. The hardware is already there, and EPDs can offer quite high resolution. The challenge is ensuring the EPD's response is stable and accurately calibrated for dosimetry, as it wasn't primarily designed for that. So, careful commissioning and ongoing checks are vital.
So, film, 2D arrays, EPD.
Yeah.
Different ways to get the measured dose map. Now, how do you do that comparison? Comparing two complex 2D dose patterns, it's not like comparing two single numbers. How do you decide if they're close enough?
That's where the workhorse tool comes in, gamma analysis. This is the standard, internationally accepted method for quantitatively comparing two dose distributions, like a measured and a calculated one.
Gamma analysis.
And the key thing about gamma is that it doesn't just look at dose difference or spatial difference alone. It assesses agreement based on both criteria simultaneously.
Both dose difference and distance. How does it combine them?
Okay, imagine you pick a point in your measured dose map. The gamma algorithm then looks at the corresponding location in the calculated dose map. But it doesn't just compare the dose at that exact spot. It searches in a small region around that spot in the calculated map.
A search radius.
Exactly. A spatial search radius defined by the distance to agreement, or DTA criterion. And within that radius, it's looking for any point in the calculated map that satisfies two conditions compared to your original measured point.
Two conditions.
Condition 1. Is the dose at the calculated point within a certain percentage of the measured point's dose? That's the dose difference criterion. Condition 2. Is the calculated point spatially within that DTA distance from the measured point? Which is true by definition if it's within the search radius.
So for my measured point, it's asking, is there any point nearby in the calculated plan that has roughly the same dose?
Precisely. If the algorithm can find at least one point within that DTA distance that also meets the dose difference percentage criterion, then your original measured point is considered to pass the gamma test. We calculate a value called the gamma index, and if it's less than or equal to 1, it passes.
And if it searches that whole DTA neighborhood in the calculated map and finds no points that satisfy both the distance tolerance and the dose tolerance,
then that measured point fails. Its gamma index will be greater than 1.
Okay, so gamma 1 means pass, gamma 1 means fail for a single point.
Yeah.
What are the standard numbers used for those criteria? And what's the overall passing score for the whole plan QA?
The criteria are always given as dose difference percent DTA in millimeters. By far the most common criteria used for routine IMRT and VMAT QA is 3%, 3 millimeters.
3%, 3 millimeters, got it.
That's the benchmark you'll hear constantly. Now, for very high-precision stuff like SRS or SBRT, where accuracy is even more critical and dose gradients are super sharp, clinics often tighten the criteria, maybe to 2 per 2 millimeters.
Okay, that's the rule for each point. What about the whole measurement? How many points need to pass?
The typical clinical goal, the action level, is that at least 95% of the points analyzed must have a gamma index less than or equal to 1, using the chosen criteria, usually 3%, 3 millimeter.
95% pass rate.
Yes. And usually this analysis excludes very low-dose regions, say below 10% or 20% of the max dose, because percentage differences down there can be noisy and not clinically meaningful.
So, bottom line for standard IMRT VMAT QA, check using gamma analysis with 3% needle millimeter criteria, and you need a pass rate of 95%, ignoring low-dose areas.
That is the absolute key take-home message for QA acceptance. If you run a QA and get, say, 92% passing at 3 per 3 millimeter, that plan stops. You investigate why it failed before it goes anywhere near a patient.
You had a good analogy for this, the crowd photos.
Yeah, the crowd photos. Imagine you have 2 photos of a big crowd taken moments apart. Photo A is your measured dose. Photo B is your calculated dose. For each person in photo A, gamma asks, can I find anyone in photo B who is standing within, say, 3 feet of where this person is? That's your 3 millimeter DTA. And D is wearing a shirt that's within 3% of the same color brightness. That's your 3% dose difference.
Okay.
If you can find any match in photo B within that 3-foot circle that also meets the 3% color match, the person in photo A passes gamma, index 1. If you search that whole circle and no one meets both conditions, they fail, index 1. And you need over 95% of the people in photo A to find a suitable match in photo B.
That really clarifies the combined check. It's not just location or dose, it's getting both right within tolerance. Okay, so we've covered the inverse planning, the complex delivery, the mandatory QA with gamma. Why do we go through all this complexity? What are the big clinical wins that make IMRT and VMAT the standard now for so many sites?
It really comes down to achieving better treatment outcomes by being able to shape the dose much more precisely. The biggest advantage is superior conformality.
Better shaping of the dose.
Yeah. Because you can modulate the intensity across the beam from many angles, you can create really complex, irregular high-dose regions. Think concave shapes, shapes that wrap around things, shapes with holes in them. You can make the high-dose volume hug the PTV much more tightly than you ever could with simple 3D beams.
Like shrink-wrapping the dose around the target.
Exactly. And the direct consequence of that tight conformality is better organ at-risk sparing.
Because if the high dose stops right at the target edge,
you can keep it out of the critical normal tissues right next door. We can actively sculpt the dose away from OARs. Think head and neck cancer, sparing the parotid glands to reduce dry mouth. Prostate cancer, sparing the rectum and bladder. This ability to dramatically lower OAR doses is huge for reducing side effects and improving quality of life.
And does this better sparing ever let you push the tumor dose higher?
Yes, that's the third major benefit, dose escalation potential. If you can confidently meet the dose constraints for all the nearby ORRs using IMRT or VMAT, it might allow you to safely increase the dose delivered to the tumor itself, potentially improving the chance of cure. This is a key strategy in certain cancers where higher dose equals better control, provided you don't harm the normal tissues.
So, better target coverage, less dose to critical organs, maybe higher tumor dose. Those are compelling reasons. But like you always say, there are always trade-offs in physics. What are the downsides or things we need to watch out for with IMRT VMAT?
Absolutely. There are important considerations. One big one is the increased low-dose bath.
Low-dose bath.
Yeah. While IMRT VMAT excel at creating sharp dose fall-offs near the target and keeping high doses out of specific OORs, the use of many beam angles or continuous arcs means that a larger volume of normal tissue often receives a low dose compared to a simpler 3D plan with just a few fields. Think of it as a light sprinkling of dose over a wider area.
Is that low-dose sprinkle a problem?
It's a subject of ongoing research and discussion, primarily concerning the theoretical long-term risk of radiation-induced secondary cancers. While the absolute risk is generally considered low, irradiating a larger volume, even to low doses, is something to be aware of, especially when treating younger patients who have many decades of life ahead. It's a different dose-volume trade-off compared to 3D CRT.
Okay, low-dose bath. What else?
Another critical one is sensitivity to setup and motion. Because these plans are so highly conformal, with steep dose gradients right at the edge of the target.
There's no room for error.
Pretty much. If the patient isn't positioned perfectly exactly the same way every day, or if the target moves during treatment, like due to breathing, even a small geometric shift, just a few millimeters, can cause a significant problem. Part of the target might move out of the high-dose zone, getting underdosed, or a sensitive OAR might move into the high-dose zone, getting overdosed.
Yikes. So accuracy is paramount.
Absolutely. Which is why robust image-guided radiation therapy, IGRT, is essentially mandatory for IMRT and VMAT. You must use imaging, like cone beam CT or KV X-rays, right before treatment each day to verify the patient's position and make sure the target is aligned correctly before you press the beam on button.
And what about targets that move continuously, like lung tumors? Does the dynamic delivery itself cause issues?
Yes, for targets with significant internal motion, there's the potential for interplay effects.
Interplay.
It's the complex interaction between the moving MLC leaves in sliding window or VMAT, or the changing dose reduction speed in VMAT, and the moving target. For example, the MLC might sweep open to deliver high intensity just as the tumor moves out of that spot, and then sweep close just as the tumor moves back in. This could lead to unexpected hot or cold spots within the target.
How serious is that?
For standard fractionated treatments delivered over many weeks, these interplay effects tend to average out over the full course, so the final delivered dose is usually pretty close to what was planned. But it's a much bigger concern for stereotactic treatments like SBRT or SABR, where you give huge doses in just a few fractions. There's less opportunity for averaging, so motion management techniques become absolutely critical.
Right. And the last consideration.
Just the workflow impact. Inverse planning takes more time and expertise than forward planning, and the mandatory patient-specific QA adds a significant step in physics workload compared to the simpler checks needed for 3D CRT. It just adds complexity and time to the whole process.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we had to boil all of this down for someone reviewing for, say, their physics boards,
Yeah.
what are the absolute must-remember clinical pearls for IMRT and VMAT?
All right, let's do the high-yield distillation. Key points for boards. 1. Planning. No, it's inverse planning. Starts with objectives, target dose, and constraints, OAR limits. These feed a cost function. An optimization algorithm minimizes this cost, producing ideal fluence maps. Then, a leaf sequencing algorithm converts these maps into deliverable MLC segments weights, considering machine limits, speed, width, transmission.
Got it. Planning, inverse sets of constraints, cost function, optimizer, fluence map, leaf sequencer, deliverable plan.
Perfect summary. 2. Delivery techniques. Know the difference. Step and shoot, static gantry, beam O off F between segments. Sliding window, static gantry, beam on while leaves sweep. VMAT, rotating gantry, simultaneous modulation of MLCs, dose rate, maybe gantry speed.
Step and shoot, stop, start, sliding window, sweep,
All right,
beam
look.
on. Okay.
3. VMAT advantages. Compared to step and shoot IRNE, remember VMAT is generally much faster delivery and often uses comparable or lower total MUs.
Faster, maybe fewer MUs, Jack.
Core. QA. Patient-specific QA is mandatory. You deliver the patient's plan to a phantom, measure the dose, and compare it to the TPS calculation for that phantom. Mandatory. Cannot stress that enough.
Mandatory patient QA.
Got it. And 5. Gamma analysis. This is the A tool for that QA comparison. It checks dose difference, percent and distance to agreement simultaneously. Standard criteria. 3%, 3 millimeters, standard goal. 95% of points passing, gamma index U1, usually ignoring low-dose regions.
Gamma. Dose A and D distance. Check 3% to of 95% pass rate. Crystal clear. Those 5 points really cover the core physics essentials. All right, let's lock this in with a quick board review blitz. Ready?
Let's do it.
Question 1. Which of the following best describes the fundamental difference between inverse planning on IMRT VMAT and forward planning, 3D CRT? A. Inverse uses manual shaping. Forward uses optimization. B. Inverse needs more MUs than forward. C. Inverse starts with desired dose constraints, then calculates beams. D. Forward uses MLCs. Inverse uses blocks.
Okay, the answer there has to be C. Inverse planning starts with the desired dose distribution, the objectives and constraints, and the computer figures out the beam intensities needed. Forward planning is the opposite. You define the beams, computer calculates the dose. A is backward, B isn't necessarily true, D is wrong as both use MLCs.
Correct. Question 2. A physicist does QA for a VMAT plan. Gamma analysis gives 92% passing rate using 3x3 millimeter criteria. What's the most likely next step based on typical standards? A. Approve it, 92% is fine. B. Redo gamma with tighter 2x2 millimeter criteria. C. Investigate the discrepancy before treatment. D. Ignore it. Gamma is just a suggestion.
Right, we just hammered this. The answer is C. The typical goal is 95% pass rate at 3% 3 millimeter. 92% is below that threshold. It signifies a problem that must be investigated and resolved before the patient can be treated. It's definitely not just a suggestion.
Exactly. Question 3. Comparing a 9-field step-and-shoot IMRT plan to a dual-arc VMAT plan for the same complex target, what's generally true about VMAT? A. Much longer delivery time. B. Substantially higher total MUs. C. Generally faster treatment delivery. D. Simpler planning and QA process.
Okay, I think VMAT advantages. The big one is speed, so C is the correct answer. VMAT is generally much faster to deliver than multi-field step-and-shoot. A is wrong. B is often wrong. VMAT might have lower MUs. D is wrong. VMAT complexity is generally higher.
Perfect. Final question, number 4. What is the primary function of the leaf sequencing algorithm in the TPS for IMRT VMAT? A. Defines initial beam angles weights.
Yes.
B. Minimizes the cost function during optimization. C. Converts the ideal fluence map into deliverable MLC segments MUZ. D. Calculates total dose to critical organs.
Okay, primary function of leaf sequencing. That's the step that bridges the ideal map to the real machine. So the answer is C. It takes the optimized fluence map and translates it into the actual MLC shapes and weights MUs the machine can deliver, respecting its limits. A is planner setup, B is the optimization algorithm, D is a later dose calculation.
Excellent. Nailed those. And now, as promised, a little something to lighten the load after all that physics.
Uh-oh, prepare for groans.
Why did the radiation oncologist break up with the photon beam?
Okay, why?
Because it was just too intense and had way too many angles.
Force chuck. Okay. IMRT and VMAT. Intense, many angles. I see what you did there. Hopefully our listeners feel they can handle the intensity now.
We hope so. So let's quickly recap the ground we covered in this deep dive on IMRT and VMAT physics and QA. We started with the shift from 3D CRT's forward planning to the inverse planning paradigm.
Right, where you define the clinical goals, first objectives and constraints, letting the optimizer figure out the ideal fluence maps using a cost function.
Then we saw how the crucial leaf sequencing algorithm translates those ideal maps into practical, deliverable instructions for the MLCs, considering all the machine's physical limitations.
Yep, and we looked at the delivery methods. Step-and-shoot IMRT with its static segments, sliding window IMRT with its dynamic sweeps, and the highly efficient VMAT modulating dose during continuous rotation.
We absolutely hammered home that patient-specific QA is mandatory for every single plan.
No exceptions, delivered to phantom, measure, compare to calculation.
Using gamma analysis as the standard comparison tool, checking both dose difference and distance to agreement, aiming for that or 95% pass rate at 3% 3 millimeter.
And we balanced the powerful advantages, superior conformality, better OAR sparing, potential for dose escalation with the important trade-offs.
Like the increased low-dose bath, the critical sensitivity to setup and motion-demanding robust IGRT, potential interplay effects with moving targets, and the added workflow complexity.
It's clear these techniques offer incredible power to shape dose precisely, but that power comes with responsibility, meticulous planning, delivery, and especially verification.
Absolutely. And it really represents a leap in our ability to target cancer effectively while minimizing harm. Thinking about all this complexity and precision, it does make you wonder where things go next, doesn't it? How do we refine these techniques further or adapt them for even more challenging situations like radiosurgery?
That's a great point. It feels like the natural next step in the conversation, how these principles are pushed to the limit in SRS and SBRT. Definitely something to chew on.
Indeed. And speaking of next steps, remember you can practice for your own exams with oral boards at RadOncSmartLearn.com. Definitely subscribe to RadOnc Smart Review so you don't miss our next session.
Thanks everyone for tuning in.